Okay, I think we're going to get started now. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming to day 2 of this wonderful conference. We have many exciting speakers coming up today, and we're going to kick the day off with Hayden. So Hayden Wilkinson is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Global Priorities Institute. He completed his PhD in philosophy at the Australian National University in 2021 and has previously held visiting fellowships at Princeton and at Oxford. His current work focuses on moral decision-making under great uncertainty. So after Hayden's talk, which will be approximately 40 minutes, we'll take questions from the app. Hopefully you're all familiar with how to work the question thing, but if you're not sure, you go to the event, press live discussion, and you can submit your question there. You can also upvote other people's questions if you'd like to hear them answered. And with that, I will hand over to Hayden. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daisy, and thanks everyone for coming. So this morning, I want to give you an idea of the work that's been going on in academic global priorities research and why it might be useful in your own attempts to do good, in your own decisions on how to allocate your donations, your career, and so on. I'll be running you through 4 of what are, in my view, the most important findings that have come out of the field so far. First off, what is global priorities research? Here's the definition that 80,000 Hours uses. It's the rigorous study of what the most important global problems are, how to compare them, and how best to address them. And here's the definition that we use at the Global Priorities Institute. It's research into issues that arise when we're trying to figure out what we should do with a given amount of limited resources like our money, our time, our energy, if our aim is to do the most good possible. By either definition, this includes very applied research, like the work done at, say, GiveWell or Animal Charity Evaluators, in evaluating different interventions in particular cause areas like global health, development, or animal welfare. It also includes work on more fundamental abstract questions, such as what criteria we should use to compare interventions, how we should evaluate evidence for an intervention's effects, and what outcomes even count as good in the first place. At GPI, where we're working within academic philosophy and economics, we're focused on the fundamental side. But as I hope to show you today, even research on these more fundamental questions can have big implications for how we all make decisions. In particular, I'll be talking about research topics in philosophy that we've made progress on, since philosophy is what I know about. Okay, so one fundamental question that we've been focusing on for the last few years is whether long-termism is true. The claim that in the most important decision situations facing us today, which of our options are best is mainly determined by those options' effects on the far future. And note that best here doesn't mean it actually turns out best, but rather when we're making the decision, when we're uncertain of the outcome, it's the best gamble to choose. So if long-termism is true for decisions about, say, where to donate, then perhaps it's better to donate to biosecurity or AI to reduce the risk of human extinction than it is to give to, say, the Against Malaria Foundation and save lives from malaria. Or, if it is better to donate to AMF, it's only better because it has some better long-run effect. Either way, the best option should be best, or it would be best because of its long-run effects. That's what long-termism says. And note that it doesn't say what would make the future better, or what makes one option better than another. It's potentially compatible with a very wide range of philosophical and moral views, not just views like utilitarianism and expected value theory, if those mean anything. This claim, long-termism, it could still hold on any philosophical views that agree that the best things to do involve influencing the future. But is it true? That's the billion-dollar question, or the $46 billion question. Whether it's true or not could completely reverse what we should be doing, from combating malaria to combating extinction risk, or vice versa. So it's pretty important to figure it out. Or even if you're already pretty certain that it's true or false, it's still pretty important to make sure that it is indeed true or false. So to figure out whether long-termism is true, one important sub-question is how we should judge risk. Actions aimed at improving the far future tend to be risky. They have only a fairly small probability of succeeding. While actions aimed at having an impact in the short term, they often have an impact with a bit more certainty. So here's the sort of case that we tend to face when we're choosing between an intervention that benefits the near future versus one that benefits the far future. So here, you've got some money to donate, or maybe in practice, you've got a career you're deciding what to do with, and you've got 2 ways to spend it. One option is to try to benefit the world in the short term option, which, let's say, has a certainty of improving 1,000 lives. And you've also got the long-term option, which has this tiny probability of improving an enormous number of lives. I think, yes, here it's a billion lives, but maybe in practice it's, trillions of trillions of trillions. Okay, so the long-term option has this only tiny probability of success, much more likely it's going to make no difference whatsoever. And note that these numbers here are completely made up. In reality, the probability of the long-term option succeeding might be much higher, might be much lower. That's a question for people that do applied work. But regardless of the real-world accuracy here, how should we decide which option is morally better when there's such a stark choice between kind of a sure payoff and something that seems extremely risky? So one common view about what we should do in these cases is that we should choose whichever option maximizes the expected benefit. That means for each option, we take the average of how good the outcome will be, weighted by the probability. So each possible value that the outcome would have kind of gets a vote in proportion to how likely the outcome is. So to do that, we multiply how good each outcome is by how probable it is, and then we add it up. So for the long-term option here, we multiply 1 billion by 1 in 1,000, plus the remaining probability, whatever it is, times 0, so it's going to be 0. And the expected benefit is 1 million lives improved. By the way, just assuming that all these lives are improved by the same amount in both options. And 1 million lives is far greater a benefit than the short-term option, which was 1,000 lives. So maximizing expected benefit as an approach says that we should take the riskier long-term option here. But another view is that we could be risk-averse, that we should be more concerned with avoiding risk and place extra importance on getting some okay outcomes for sure, rather than providing zero benefit at all. Okay. And a lot of the work at GPI has focused on basically this question, how we should choose in cases like this, whether morally we should just maximize the expected benefits or instead be risk-averse. And the first key result, the first of 4 that I'm going to be describing, deals with just that. So here's one way that you might think of that case from just before. By valuing the outcomes based on how much of a difference you make in each outcome. The short-term option, both options are there. The short-term option gives you an outcome of value 1, regardless of whether there would be a catastrophe or not, that the long-term option would aim at addressing. Yeah. And the long-term option, which aims to prevent some great catastrophe, gives you value 0 if no catastrophe were to happen because you've made 0 difference. You've had no impact. And if a catastrophe was going to happen, then you have this enormous value. I've just realized that I've got to update this slide. It shouldn't be quite that high. So read 1 million rather than 10 to the 40. Yeah. So of course that outcome is really good. You've prevented something absolutely horrible. So you've made quite a big difference. And putting the case this way, it does certainly look like the short-term option is much safer. If you're risk-averse, you should go with the short-term one because you're not risking this very high probability of making no difference at all. But there's another way to look at these two options. Not in terms of the difference you make, but in terms of how good the outcomes are as a whole, regardless of what influence came from you and what influence came from elsewhere. So, okay. Again, 10 to the 40 should be different, but still just a very large number. So if there's no catastrophe, if there were not going to be a catastrophe, then whatever you do, there's all this value in the world in the left-hand column. It's a pretty good outcome. There's all these happy lives, but there's one extra happy life if you choose the short-term option, or one extra kind of unit of value. But if the catastrophe would have happened, then the outcome of the short-term option is far, far worse, because catastrophe happened and you didn't do anything to prevent it. And so now the worst case scenario, in terms of how good or bad the world is the one where the catastrophe happens and you haven't prevented it. And if we look at the case this way, then the short-term option seems far riskier. If this is what we're interested in, the value of the world as a whole, rather than the difference you make, and you're concerned about avoiding the worst case scenarios, then you should choose the long-term option. Or at least being risk-averse would push you further towards preferring the long-term option. So depending on which of these two ways we look at the situation, risk aversion pushes us in different directions. It leads to different judgments. So which is the right way to look at it? It turns out there's some pretty compelling reasons that we should look at it in the second way. So one reason is this. Consider this case. There's a coin flip, and you've got three options. One is to do nothing, in which case the world has value 1, let's say. You could choose action A or action B. If you choose A, the value of the world becomes 2 or 1, depending on which side the coin flip comes up. And if you do B, it becomes 1 or 2, which is the same as A, but what outcomes are associated with which sides of the coin is flipped around. And A and B seem equally good. They're exactly the same gamble, just swapping around heads of the coin. They give the same values with the same probabilities. They just vary by which side of the coin they're associated with. So it seems like they should obviously be equally good. They're just the same thing. But what if we look at this case based on the difference you make compared to doing nothing? Then we have this. Do A, and you make a difference of value 1 either way, compared to doing nothing. And do B, you make a difference of either 0 or 2, since that's what we get if we take the difference between B's values down here and the do nothing option. And then B looks riskier than A. A guarantees difference 1, while B risks you making a difference of 0. So looking at the gamble in the top way, risk aversion pushes us towards preferring A over B. But this way of looking at the situation seems mistaken. When A and B are just precisely the same gamble with the same outcomes, the same probabilities, their only difference is swapping around which side of the coin goes with what. It just doesn't seem plausible that either of them is better. And so analyzing these situations in terms of just the difference you make seems like it's a mistake. And maybe this isn't so surprising. We can consider another case of catastrophe in a different setting. Here, you're deciding whether or not to buy a fire extinguisher to protect your house from burning down, and suppose this is a very effective fire extinguisher. It completely removes the risk that your house will burn down. So if there's a probability of 1 in 10, if you just buy the pizza, that your house will burn down. If you buy the fire extinguisher, then you remove that 1 in 10 probability of the house burning down. So by buying the extinguisher, in terms of the difference you make, there's a probability of 9 in 10 that your purchase makes no difference whatsoever, that the house wasn't going to burn down. But there's a probability of 1 in 10 that buying the fire extinguisher causes your house to be saved. And so it's made a big difference. Whereas spending money on pizza, you know that you will enjoy the pizza no matter what, regardless of whether your house burns down, so you've made a difference to how happy you are. Okay. So putting it this way, it seems like buying the fire extinguisher is the riskier option, that it's safer to buy the pizza. And so being risk averse would make you more inclined to buy the pizza than if you just maximize the expected benefit. But in this case, I think we have a good intuitive sense about what it's rational to do, and also what it's rational for someone who's averse to risk to kind of lean towards. They should buy the fire extinguisher. And risk aversion should make them even more inclined to buy the fire extinguisher and prevent the genuine catastrophe here, the genuine risk, which is their house burning down. And this is what we get if we frame the situation in the other way, in terms of how good the outcome is overall, and in terms of this, it's far less risky to buy the fire extinguisher. It gives you a certainty of something pretty good. And in effect, this situation is analogous to the long-term option and the short-term option from before, where the long-term option, despite being unlikely to make a difference, is safeguarding against some risk of great catastrophe. And so the proper way to approach the long-term versus the short-term case, if you're risk-averse, if we stay consistent with these sorts of cases, is to place even greater weight on the benefit of reducing risks of future catastrophe. Okay. So here's the first key result. Being averse to risk doesn't really provide good justification for preferring seemingly safe short-term interventions over long-term interventions, at least those that are aimed at preventing catastrophe. That's not going to be all long-term interventions, which I'll explain in a sec. And note that I've only very roughly sketched the arguments here. If you want the full version, the paper is at the bottom there. Highly recommend going and having a read. Okay, but what about long-term interventions that are actually riskier? Interventions that don't just address some risk of catastrophe, but instead just have some chance of vastly improving many lives on top of what would otherwise happen. So here's such a case. Again, you have some money to donate, and you have two options. One is a safe benefit, certainty of improving one life. One is a risky benefit. You have a probability of 1 in 1,000 of improving a billion lives, and otherwise improving no lives at all. It turns out that when we're making decisions like this, even when they are genuinely risky, in practice, there's a good argument for taking the risky option here, to not be risk averse at all, to effectively maximize the expected benefit. And this argument is for doing whatever has the biggest impact on average, which here is the risky one. But to make that argument, it'll help to visualize the different options. Here's what's called a cumulative probability distribution of each of the two options, safe and risky. On the horizontal axis is the size of the benefit that the option produces, and on the vertical axis is the probability of producing a benefit worse than that, or less than that. Remember that the safe option is guaranteed to improve one life, so at value 1, it jumps from probability 0 up to probability 1. And for any value higher than that, it's guaranteed to do worse, so it stays at probability 1. And the risky option, it jumps up at value 0 because it has a probability of giving you value 0, but it doesn't jump up all the way to probability 1, it's still a little bit lower, because there was a slight probability it would have this enormous benefit. And so it only reaches 1 when you get all the way over here. Okay. In general, looking at these sorts of graphs, we want higher probabilities, better outcomes. So if we're going to illustrate our options this way, visually what we want is for a curve to be further to the right or further down. If one curve is always above the other, then it's worse, because it's just giving you lower probabilities of good things and higher probabilities of worse things. For instance, to illustrate that kind of relationship, consider these two options. So one is just safe, you benefit one person for sure, and the other is safe plus a chance of something better. By this option, you benefit one person, and then you flip a coin, which if it lands heads, benefits 1,000 more people. Worst case scenario, you still benefit one person, but you've got a strictly higher probability of benefiting even more people than that. And notice that this property appears on the graph. So safe plus the coin flipped is always below or equal to the other curve. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. Okay. The red one is still safe. The blue one is safe plus the coin flip. And this appears on the graph. The blue one is always below or equal to the red one. In general, when you have one of these curves always as low or lower than the other, then it means it has as high or higher a probability of an outcome just as good as whatever that value is. So in general, the lower curve, when it's kind of strictly lower or it's never above, it represents a strict improvement over the higher one, no matter how risk averse you might be. Like any rational agent is going to say the blue one is better. But remember that we didn't have this relationship with the safe and risky options before. Sometimes safe is higher, sometimes risky is higher, so neither of them gives a higher probability of being as good as any good outcome. But remember, in decision making, we care about how good the world as a whole turns out, not just the difference that you individually make. And how good the world as a whole turns out doesn't just depend on what you do. If you improve, one life with certainty, it's not just guaranteed that there'll be one life ever lived. Instead, there's everything else that goes on in the universe, everything you don't directly change through your action. And you should be uncertain about, what happens in the rest of the universe unless you're, completely omniscient. And this uncertainty over what happens in the rest of the universe will have a probability distribution of its own, which will look like this. According to some compelling arguments in the paper at the bottom, which I don't have time to go into. So this is what the two curves from before were missing. The risk and uncertainty of each option isn't just the risk and uncertainty of how many lives you benefit. Really, it's, if you care about the world as a whole, it's the risk and uncertainty of how the world as a whole turns out, which will look like this. So safe plus that gamble over what happens in the rest of the universe versus risky plus that gamble over what happens in the rest of the universe. These are the options that you're really choosing between from an impartial standpoint. And notice that now one of these curves is always at least as high as the other. Safe plus the rest of the universe is always as high as the risky one, and sometimes it's strictly higher. So for any value, risky plus the rest of the universe gives just as high a probability of an outcome that good, and sometimes a strictly higher probability of an outcome that good. So risky plus this is a strict improvement over safe plus this. No matter how risk averse you are, you'll end up saying that risky plus the rest of the universe is the better gamble, once you consider kind of your full uncertainty. And this result happens in general when the rest of the universe is far bigger than the effects of your actions. and you're appropriately uncertain about it, and some other minor provisos. Whichever lottery has the greater expected benefit, in this case risky, becomes the better option overall. So here's key result number 2. If you care about how good the world as a whole is, rather than just idiosyncratically your own impact, then there's a strong argument for maximizing the expected benefit in at least many of your moral decisions. Risk aversion, there's strong arguments not to be risk averse. Okay, and again, I've just sketched the argument here. If you're interested, highly recommend reading the paper. This also has a neat implication in cases like this, cases of diversification. This is a case that's sometimes discussed on the EA forum. I think there have been a few posts talking about whether it's rational to donate to multiple charities or just one. And if you think each charity has some probability of having pretty good impact, but some risk of having no impact, then you might want to play it safe and give a little bit to every charity, because then whichever one ends up having an impact, or if any of them do, you've had at least some impact through your donation. So focus on one charity, you have probability 1 in 4 of a large impact by this fictional charity, or diversifying between many, a probability of 9 in 10, let's say, of at least some impact, and probability of 1 in 10 of no impact. So supposing the one charity has higher expected value than any of the others, then maximizing the expected benefit will say to focus on the one charity. And risk aversion might seem to suggest that you should diversify between many. But if you're considering kind of the full gamble produced by your actions, the world as a whole, then this last result means that you shouldn't diversify. You should just load all of your donations and all of your investment into what might be quite a risky option, but whatever has the highest expected benefit. Or so the argument goes. Okay. So another reason to doubt long-termism is that our most effective ways of affecting the long-term future, or at least according to arguments that people bandy about, the most effective ways are by mitigating the risk of human extinction. But you might think that extinction isn't really a bad thing. So if you're faced with this choice between a quick extinction for humanity, where for the next 200 years everyone has a great life, but then we kind of painlessly cease to exist, and a long future but at great cost, where the next 200 years is pretty miserable, but then as a result of paying this great cost, we then get to live for millions more. You might think that actually quick extinction isn't so bad, and perhaps even that it's better. In which case, mitigating risks of human extinction doesn't seem like that important a thing. Equivalently, sorry, too many animations. Yeah. Equivalently, you might think that the diagram on the left here is better than the diagram on the right, which I should explain. So each of these is an outcome. The first one, the population is represented by this box. How high it is represents how well off everyone is in the population. So the higher the box, the happier everyone is. And how wide it is represents how big the population. So the wider box, there are more people. So the one on the right here has however many of us living great lives, and the one on the left, has however many of us living great lives, and the one on the right has those same people for the next 200 years living worse lives, followed by many future generations which have pretty good lives. So on the right, all of their lives are a bit worse than ours, maybe due to, well, the future people, their lives are worse than ours, maybe due to climate change or some other kind of long-lasting nasty effect that we have. But their lives are still better than death. Like they're still having lives worth living. They're not constantly suffering or anything. They're just not quite as comfortable as us. And you might think that the one on the right is worse. After all, the next 200 years of people are made worse off by choosing that option, and our descendants are then worse off than we would otherwise be. So this means the average well-being of everyone who exists is lower, and the only people who would plausibly benefit in going with the option on the right are all those future people who get to exist. But you might think that, well, they didn't really have anything to complain about in the scenario on the left, since they didn't exist. So they're not really harmed in some sense. The only benefit we're giving them, you might think, is bringing them into existence, and maybe that isn't a genuine benefit to someone at all. So there are a few reasons you might think the one on the left is better. And a few moral views seem to support this conclusion. So one view is that only average well-being matters, and so the short future with high well-being, it's going to have a higher average, it's going to be better. Another view is that only the level of equality in well-being matters. Again, the one on the left is more equal. And you might also, or you might think that merely bringing additional good lives into existence doesn't constitute an improvement in a moral sense. Again, then you're not going to think the one on the right was an improvement. And the people who exist either way are worse off, so it seems worse. Okay. But these views, at least most of them, they don't actually support that conclusion in practice when we consider our full situation. Again, we can't just think of a tiny slice of the total population if we're thinking about how good an outcome is on average, or about how equal it is. We need to compare outcomes based on how good they are overall, so we need to consider the whole outcome, including people not affected by your choice, the background population. Yeah. So this background population, the rest of the universe, that's going to include people who existed before extinction occurs. It's going to include people who lived in the past. It's going to include members of other species who will live on no matter what happens to humanity, and also whatever other life the universe happens to contain. And these all contribute to how well the world goes, even if you can't affect them. And on some reasonable assumptions, this background population is much bigger than the population you directly affect through your actions. And we might think of it as having wildly varying levels of well-being like this. It's kind of jagged up and down. Who knows what it actually looks like. It turns out, if you let this background population grow to much larger than the population you're affecting, as it likely is in practice, a lot of those moral views that suggest that extinction wouldn't be so bad, they end up converging to views that say extinction is really bad. So the view that only average well-being matters, it converges to what's known as a critical level view, the view that adding additional lives is good as long as they're above some critical level, and if future lives would be sufficiently good, then this says that extinction is bad. And views that say that only equality matters with a large background population, they converge to what's known as prioritarianism, a view that adding additional good lives is always good, but it gives extra priority to improving lives of the worst off. If we think of extinction scenarios like this, where you've got the near future, the next 200 years of humanity, you've got the rest of the universe, which is huge and who knows what it looks like, and then you've got humanity in the future, which is, let's suppose they're going to be really well off, they're going to have great lives because of new technologies, and hopefully we mitigate climate change sufficiently and so on. If future people have lives better than ours, then all of those views are going to say, actually, yes, this is better than just letting us go extinct, once we consider that background population. Yeah, all of those views agree, extinction is really, really bad, and preventing extinction is far, far more important than other priorities, or at least that's the conclusion they spit out. So here's result number 3. On a wide range of views in population ethics, in practice, when we consider the background population, preventing risks of human extinction are plausibly extremely important. Okay. And again, recommend going and reading the paper. Now you might notice that each of the previous three results effectively serve as an argument for long-termism, but this last one is more of a mixed bag. In some sense it justifies long-termism, whereas in another sense it requires us to be extremely cautious in influencing the long-term future, and to avoid doing so when the benefits aren't enormous. Here's a kind of basic moral case, not worrying about long-termism for now. You've got a decision between doing nothing, you have no effect on the world, and harming in order to benefit. So you kill one person and you save 2 others from death. Now intuitively, if you have a heart, then intuitively you're going to recognize that the second option is wrong. It might produce a better outcome. It would be better for 2 lives to be saved than for 1 to be saved. In terms of number of happy lives, the second outcome is better, but it's still wrong to do, or plausibly wrong to do. It requires doing a great wrong in order to achieve that outcome. So you might think you shouldn't do it. That seems right. And that's perfectly consistent with long-termism, because after all, long-termism it isn't just utilitarianism. It's like this much broader conclusion. So this intuition is upheld by lots of moral theories. Many theories tell us to do no harm. They agree that avoiding harming people is much more important than merely benefiting people. You shouldn't kill one to save many, unless you're saving an extremely large number of people. But when we give moral weight to what happens long in the future, it turns out, well, all significant actions cause all sorts of harms and benefits. For instance, if you do something straightforwardly good, like saving a life, if you save a life, then have a bunch of effects. One of them is changing the identities of that person's future descendants. If they survive and they have kids, then those are some kids that wouldn't have existed otherwise. If those kids have kids, and so on. Then potentially you're affecting this extremely long stream of their future dynasty. Another effect you have is that that child, or that person who you save, and all of their descendants, they interact with other people and affect those other people's conception actions, and that's pretty easy to do. So just the way that human conception works, because there's many sperm competing for one egg. If you just kind of like change the timing of conception, or the time of day or the weather or anything, very likely it's going to be a different one of like the million sperm that reach the egg, and so you end up with a child with completely different DNA, and DNA predicts at least some features of someone's life, like their empathy or cruelty, their success in life due to whatever, like so if you have like a fairly large scale effect in the world, like changing whether one person exists, you're going to change whether they go around interacting with their friends and holding up traffic occasionally, and that's going to affect at least some of those people they interact with, like kind of going home to have to conceive a child that night, and so by this person who wouldn't have otherwise existed, kind of holding them up, that changes the identities of these children, and so on. If this person themselves has lots of children, then you're kind of affecting conception events throughout the rest of human history. So the population composition will look very different. Okay. Other things will happen. So by changing all those identities, you've got to change some historical events. For instance, which people get elected to high office, because different people will exist. Also, different voters will exist. This is also going to affect like when and how certain catastrophes happen. They might affect the identity of some future AI researcher, or whoever, a future Elon Musk or something. And by just making all these changes to all these lives, like making some lives better, making some lives worse, changing whether these catastrophes happen and where, for certain that you're going to end up causing harm to a lot of people. You're going to make a lot of people worse off than they would otherwise be, and you're going to benefit countless others of roughly the same amount, because you don't have any evidence either way how saving that one life will affect the rest of human history. So you should put roughly equal probability on it kind of causing a net harm and it causing a net benefit, and also on it causing any particular harm or benefit. So the changes typically cascade and grow over time, becoming far greater than the initial change you made of just saving one life. And the same goes for pretty much any action you might take that has kind of a significant effect on the world, like changing whether a person exists. So if you weigh harms more heavily than you weigh benefits in moral decision making, you probably shouldn't go around saving lives. Plausibly, you should save as few lives as possible. You certainly shouldn't do things like even more large scale, things like changing political institutions or mitigating existential risks. These are much bigger changes, much bigger harms involved. So that's what the authors of this paper call the paralysis argument, which goes like this. We shouldn't do something if it causes similar amounts of harm and benefit, and if we have a less harmful alternative. But actually, all actions cause great harm and great benefit, and of a similar magnitude. So it seems like there's a lot of actions we shouldn't do. Therefore, in most decisions, really we should just do whatever action has the least effect on the far future, because that will avoid producing such great harms. There's an exception: actions aimed at providing especially large long-term benefits, which might then outweigh these kind of random harms that we're causing. So we should avoid having any great effect on the future, except when engaging in extremely beneficial long-termist interventions, or so the argument goes. So maybe some ways of not affecting the future too much, perhaps just improving current lives without saving lives, merely kind of improving the comfort of people who currently exist, or maybe improving animal lives, improving the lives of animals on factory farms in particular, where those animals maybe don't have any descendants, or their descendants won't have a significant impact on the world like humans tend to do. And note that This line of argument, it rules out long-termism in decisions, rules out long-termism in cases where we can't provide these big, unambiguous benefits to the future without similar risks of harm. So kind of borderline long-termist interventions where we think there's actually a pretty significant chance of harm, and we're just, the expectation is slightly positive, but we're not quite sure. In such decisions, this argument will weigh against doing anything with long-term impacts, unless it's kind of unambiguously good. It rules out kind of borderline interventions. So the result that comes out of this, somewhat controversial. So on moral views that say that avoiding harms is more important than providing benefits, long-termism is plausibly false in decision situations where you don't have options with extremely positive long-term benefits. And again, I've just sketched the argument, highly recommend reading the paper. So, okay, those are the 4 big results I wanted to share with you. Hopefully they provide some useful insight for your own decisions about how to do good, especially about the issue of whether to focus on short-term interventions or on long-term, much riskier interventions. And hopefully these results give you some idea of the sort of approach we take at GPI, rather than engaging in a very concrete analysis of different cause areas, like measuring the exact number of lives that you can save per £1,000 by donating to one charity. We're looking at the very big picture questions that have the potential to completely switch over our decisions from working in one area to working in another. Before I wrap up, just very quickly, those who are interested in careers doing this sort of work, I've just talked about philosophy, but there's sort of similar questions and similar research topics in economics. Here's just a bit of info on how to get involved. Those people from GPI who are here at the conference, and you can find us in the Swap Card app, there's some philosophers, there's also some economists. We're interested in talking to anyone who's currently in or thinking of going into a PhD program in philosophy or economics. And we're also in the early stages of starting up teams in psychology, history, law, and political theory. So interested researchers in those areas should definitely reach out. Okay, thanks for listening.